Well, that's the first time I've heard that. Good evening and welcome to Know Before You Grow, a committee of Petaluma Urban Chat. I'm Dan Like, and as always, thanks to Sharon Kirk, Dave Alden, and the host of other people who make this happen. Few quick notes. We've been Zoom bombed. We may be again. If your screen goes blank, hang on for a minute or two and we'll get back as soon as we can. This evening is the fourth in our general plan series, 20 months of forums intended to help Petaluma residents better understand the topics that will be addressed in the general plan update and become better advocates for the land use future they want for our town. Apologies that we missed 2 weeks ago. Circumstances being what they are, we don't always have meetings come together as we'd like. I think that one has been postponed and is happening June 30th. In another 2 weeks, we have forum number 6, which is on June 9th, Climate, the Case for Saving Existing Buildings to Retain Carbon. And on June 23rd, we're going to give a little context on municipal finance. You should definitely sign up for the email list on urbanchat.org and check for the calendar and updates there. Reminder about the Brown Act. We probably have people who are subject to the Brown Act and want to respect the intent of California's public meetings rules. Keep the conversation guided more towards general questions than specific site ones. Thank you to Josh Simmons and Petaluma Civics who are rebroadcasting this meeting on Twitch and Facebook and YouTube. And it isn't an issue now, but we are expecting that some of the future ones may grow beyond my Zoom hosting capabilities. So we may sprawl out there too. And with that, I'm going to turn to monitoring chat for questions and trying to manage mutes to catch people doing embarrassing things in the background, and turn the meeting over to Bill Wolpert. Bill, take it away.
Thank you, Dan, and good evening and welcome to Know Before You Grow. It's National Historic Preservation Month, so tonight we're going to talk about historic preservation. I'd like to start by saying what it is that historic buildings mean to me, and that is that each one has a story to tell if you're patient enough to find it. You know, it may be a plasterer's signature inside an obscure corner, or a headline from 70 years ago that's stuffed into a cavity somewhere for insulation, or it could be an old permit record. But each is a record of an event that took place underneath that roof. I also respect historic buildings for the quality of the craftsmanship and the materials. Lath and plaster, old growth, redwood or Doug fir, fine moldings, and sometimes you find hand-painted tiles from a local company. Today, the skills and resources to build a home of the same quality is nearly impossible to find, not to mention the cost if you could find all the resources. And that's one reason I don't like to see historic buildings destroyed. But over the last 20 years or more, we've become more aware of the energy required not only to build a house, but also to manufacture and transport all of the building materials. It's called the embedded energy. And we've learned that good historic preservation is good resource and energy conservation. Tonight, as Petaluma begins to update its general plan, we want to illustrate why historic preservation not only preserves our heritage, but also reduces the amount of carbon we put in our air. We will show you some incentives for doing good preservation work. I was living in Pasadena and beginning my career as an architect when I was invited to join the board of Pasadena Heritage. And much of Pasadena's historic core had been saved, but not yet preserved. And Pasadena Heritage was determined not to lose it. One of the distinguished board members was Peyton Hall, a principal of Historic Resources Group, the key firm doing historic preservation in Southern California. Peyton had a master's degree from Yale and a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Virginia. He was the perfect Southern gentleman, and he still is. But if still waters run deep, Peyton was a wealth of preservation knowledge that was instrumental in preserving Pasadena's Old Town. Peyton is a distinguished fellow of the American Institute of Architects. He is now Principal Emeritus of the Historic Resources Group and has been an adjunct professor at USC School of Architecture since 1999. Peyton has been awarded many honors, including the AIA National Award for the 28th Street Apartments, a National Trust for Historic Preservation Honors Award for the Egyptian Theater in Hollywood. He's past president of the California Preservation Foundation and received the Robert F. Winter Award for California Preservationist of the Year. It is a great honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Peyton Hall.
Thanks, Bill. I didn't expect such a glowing introduction, so I owe you one. And if my screen is visible, I will proceed with the chat. Thank you. Not a lot of close reading in this presentation over the next 45 minutes or less, but this is what I told Bill that I would be talking about after we had discussed what would be useful for Petaluma and for your thinking about some of the issues, because you can't cover all of them without going too broadly, for your general plan and for your community. The first was something that didn't used to be obvious at all, and actually came up when I was in graduate school in the 1970s. Remember the oil shock? People were actually waiting in line to buy their gasoline, and there wasn't enough to go around. And all of a sudden, we became conscious of the importance of our energy sources and how we were using them, and how our building impacts used a lot of those resources. And then it seems somehow we forgot all of that until much more recently. So the first thing to understand is that the building stock, the building industry, is a huge carbon footprint. If you look at everything we do, all the tons of carbon we put in the air on an annual basis. And before we even get to those buildings that let's call significant or historic, we have an existing building stock. The majority of our buildings are already there. Are we going to throw those away, or can we look for a way to continue their use? Because any existing building is a resource that embodies extraction, manufacturing, transportation, and construction, historic or not. Petaluma, the Bay Area, Manhattan. We're not looking to replace all those buildings, but to use them, continue to use them as part of our untold sequestered tons of carbon. The second thought I had I just finished teaching, so actually my mind has loosened up a little bit, and that's a good thing. Is what is a historic resource? And it's something that context changes. I went into architecture school in 1969, and so the buildings that were being constructed about that time are over the 50 years we use as one of the benchmarks of thinking about which buildings are culturally significant or not. Whereas when I started learning and practicing, the buildings from the 20s were those buildings. So look around you, not only at the really charming downtown streets, but at the mid 20th century buildings, and also think about, why are they culturally significant? While I have a heritage in Southern Virginia, and as I just was telling Bill, much to my surprise after becoming a Californian, I have close relatives who are 49ers, but there's so many different people and cultures. California is on the forefront of that, and recognizing, the native people of California and the Latino people who were here before a lot of our ancestors were, and so many others. And it's not just about how pretty the building is, it's also about what those buildings represent. What happened there? What are their stories that can teach us and our children about California? Then sort of as a, uh, maybe counterpoint is too strong a word, but thinking about the worrisome prospect of all of our buildings becoming historically significant and therefore being constrained rather than just loving them all the way Bill and I do. There are important ways that our society and our government and our public policy has laid out at the national, state, and local levels to incentivize this work on historic buildings. It makes it easier to keep them and to pay for that getting that cycle continued into the next, to this century and the next. So outline the greenest building, which Carl Elefante will talk to you about. He's famous for the statement that the greenest building is the one that we already have, and for a lot more. And secondly, what this sort of excites me and boggles my mind at the same time. We'll talk about life cycle assessment, which seems to be the real story that we need to understand in addition to carbon footprint. Then touching on some principles and case studies, and this is mostly going to be pointing you towards some good books and authors that actually can explain to you how these numbers work, because I'm just an architect and I don't even do drawings anymore. I write words and I annoy other architects. But there are people out there who actually do the math and the research. Then we'll get to the hopefully really exciting for owners and investors and people who are transforming downtowns is the money that can help you do that. The Greenest Building. This is a very good book. It's it's aging now, but it's a great introduction. It was produced by what used to be called the Preservation Green Lab of the National Trust. You can download it from their website. Key findings and analysis. Sorry for the misspelling there. Building reuse almost always yields fewer environmental impacts than new construction when comparing buildings of similar size and functionality. That's a big statement, and it's still shocking to some people. It's like, what do you mean this old brick building with leaky wood windows, where the rainstorms and blow through is less impactful? Well, they've done the numbers. The bigger picture is not just green materials and bamboo floors and bike parking, which is all really important, or cutting down on the leaking through the windows, but this embodied energy concept, which is what we were looking at in the 70s, and that is that there's an upfront energy investment that we already have. Those materials have been grown, extracted, manufactured, transported, installed, and that is an initial embodied energy. Second, and this is still important, of course, is operating energy, our heating, our cooling, our power. If we can retrofit or deep retrofit some of our buildings, then we can improve that picture. And energy consumption in buildings in general and in historic buildings is going down, not up. One of the favorite case studies that you'll see that I haven't included here is the Empire State Building in New York City. Deep energy retrofit. Building's still there. You look at it, you don't see any change. Big changes on the inside, and its carbon footprint on an operating energy standpoint. Building transportation energy is energy used to transport occupants to and from building. Think about urban density. When we were looking at optimum, I was being taught some of these basics about, say, optimum urban development in the 70s, people were looking at what is the optimum urban density for energy conservation? Is it single family residences of 6,000 square feet on a half an acre? No, it's not even Manhattan, which are like a bunch of heat radiating spikes in the air, but it's medium density. So there are also the ways that we can think about how some of our historic neighborhoods fit into that category of an optimum density for energy conservation. I'll show you some tables from that green book from the National Trust, and I'm just looking very briefly at one of their case studies, which is an urban mixed-use building located in Portland, because that's maybe as close as we can get to a West Coast building. The building at the top right, a rehab and retrofit. This is a building type that you might see in many downtowns, big cities and small. And they've compared new construction with rehabilitation and retrofit. And they've done the homework in terms of calculating what goes into maintaining, operating a building versus replacing or constructing a new building. And a lot of really fine numbers here. So I'll mention some of the facts, and please look this up if you want to follow through, because this book also has a lot of explanation of how they did these calculations. So if we're looking at the base case for a mixed-use building, maintaining it in Portland, we have a savings of minus 21% on climate change compared to a new building, minus 24%, meaning a quarter better in terms of resource depletion. 30% better in terms of human health, and let's see, about 5% better in terms of ecosystem quality. And the book will explain where they get these numbers. So there's a strong case across the board for our existing buildings. So building type, and the case is more, we get bigger numbers in Portland because we don't have the operating energy requirements we need and to keep people from freezing to death in Chicago. For an urban village mixed use building, it takes 10 to 80 years for a new building that is 30% more efficient to break even. So you get an 80-year advantage for that mixed use building in Portland by using an existing building versus constructing a new one. And going to the bottom of this slide, which is talking about demolition versus rehab, within Multnomah County, 15% of the county's total CO2 reduction targets over the the coming decade after this was written could be met simply by retrofitting and reusing existing buildings rather than demolishing and building new efficient ones. So now these are not the numbers that are carved in stone, but it's a big difference. It's a big part of where we can go to reduce carbon footprint. Life cycle assessment. This is what I refer to as something that really excites me. I put together a program for AI that brought in people that are working in this area, and this will fundamentally sound familiar because we're talking about the life stages of a building, any building, and life cycle analysis goes to many all manufactured things and light processes that we are looking at broadly. So we start with materials manufacturing, then we have to construct it into a building. We use it and maintain it over a decade, so there's work required to keep the building going. And then we have an end of life, uh, energy consumed and waste product, landfills, transport of waste materials. So if we could measure for new versus existing buildings this life cycle stage, this life cycle analysis, and we had that data, boy, would that be really great, because then we can, if we could shine, some amazing laser tool at a building and get all this information out, and look at alternatives for material replacement and systems replacements and where we go with that, it would help us as a decision making tool for our existing and our new buildings. And this in a prettier form: extraction, transformation, or manufacturing of products, put it in a truck or in a train or helicopter and take it somewhere, uh, put it together, use it. End of life, ideally end of life. We don't want landfills, which means we have very little leftovers, and our leftovers we're reusing. So the challenge, and these are early days, and I would say this has been several years since we had that colloquium on LCA. Although LCA is doubtless the best tool for analyzing the environmental impact of product or project, the methodology and data are still being developed. It's a complex method relying on the availability and completeness of the data. So the methodologies for tabulating this material uses with LCA tools, the building analysis that I saw were really impressive, far above my mathematical capabilities and my access to data, and difficult for the people who know what they're doing, because they don't have that data for every single material and circumstance. But this is where I got the sense this is where this is going. I mean, LEED is great. Um, green building codes are great. But what we really need, and I think we will get increasingly, is enough data to, when you take your building in for a plan check, it's show me your life cycle analysis. And because our town has decided that we have a certain criteria, and this is the best way to get to that criteria if you have the data. So more broadly, um, looking at a big picture and some places that you can go for more information. I would say this is for everybody. It's a very readable book. It it leans toward people like me who are architects or builders or developers, because Gene Caroon, um, like Carl Elefante, is a leading light in the practice of green architecture and greening existing buildings. She practices in Boston. She put her heart and soul, and I feel that, because Gene is one of these people you'd love to meet and talk to, and maybe have as a speaker. Um, these are real buildings and real projects in a context of meeting preservation standards, and using green methods that you'll be familiar with. Very, very thoughtful. And I was reminded when we were preparing this that we have to say something about Donovan Ripkema. There are a couple of his reports I'm going to show you here, and to follow up, just Google Place Economics. A lot of his publications are actually available for downloads. I'm not sure that this one is, but it's a landmark publication. First edition was 1994 for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where a real economist using real numbers and real economic methodologies was saying things that we building huggers really liked. he was validating our feelings, Bill, for that these places are not only feel good to us, but that also is part of the answer that translates into livable cities and places where people want to live, as opposed to the Moreno Valley in uh, San Bernardino, Riverside County. I go there, I go to Palmdale, I see the same street with the same strip malls, and I feel nothing. Uh, and there are a lot of people who like to go somewhere and feel something and get out on the street, and go get coffee in the morning and walk with their friends. And you can't do that in the expansive suburbs. This is a great book which pulls together a lot of things he's learned from a lot of his studies. 24 Reasons Historic Preservation is Good for Your Community. And even Los Angeles, I say even Los Angeles with tongue in cheek, because of course I live on its edge, and it's a great place. I've been discovering it for the last 40 years. The LA Conservancy collected some money from people like us and hired Donovan to look closely at the numbers in Los Angeles. Now, in this case, some of it was being able to show to policymakers why preservation is good for LA, why reuse of old buildings for housing is better than tearing down a block of garden apartments and building 3 high rises or 4 big stucco boxes. Economic incentives. I'm about to take, this is the turning point where we're going from we love preservation and it's good for the environment to here's how you can make some of these things happen a little bit easier. Mills Act, property tax abatement. I don't think you have an ordinance in Petaluma. Many cities do. It's the single most important economic incentive in California. It supports preservation of qualified historic buildings. It is implemented by local ordinances, and while there certainly are some rules in the Mills Act enabling legislation out of Sacramento, you can make a lot of rules locally. It's an agreement between the city and the owner of a designated historic structure. It's literally a contract. It usually requires a local landmark listing, and local ordinances vary. For example, there are some cities who put caps on the total tax abatement, which means they have to pick which projects and how many they're going to contract with on an annual basis. There can be caps on value of property. For example, I think I've still got this right. In Beverly Hills, you don't qualify for a Mills Act property tax reduction if your house is worth more than $3 million, which leaves out most of the houses in Beverly Hills. But it's a thoughtful approach that says, if we're going to give up our property tax income, which is a big public policy and their issue, and there are a lot of needs, maybe we shouldn't be giving it to people with $20 million houses. So how many contracts per year you have, priorities and qualifications. There are many, like Pasadena, for example, you apply, but they look at who you are and what your building is and how much work your building needs. And they have some qualifications and some criteria for selecting which are the worthy properties. Here are the owners and properties that deserve some help. There's usually a detailed rehab work plan and budget, so it's not a freebie. It's not, we're going to cut your property taxes in half. You just saved, let's say, $10,000 a year. Enjoy the money. It's, we are giving you $10,000 a year so that you can complete this rehab work and this budget. We're going to help you do that because this is a valuable cultural resource. Normally, it's a 10-year contract that renews automatically. You can terminate it. You can't terminate it within under 10 years without giving back some of that money. If you have good local government, you have good staff who see that your work is done to meet preservation standards. The calculations, go to the ordinance, look it up, get some help, but it typically saves 20 to 60% per year reduction in property taxes. So commercial owners love it, condo owners love it, private. There are people who will only buy a single family house, say in places from Glendora to Pasadena, that has a Mills Act contract because it's saving them money on their property taxes every year, and they know they're going to have to replace the roof or the driveway or do something. The house is going to need help. The old building is going to need help. This is what I need to make that happen. Now, let's move up the scale to state and federal government. There is a really good federal historic tax credit, and I can say that because we've done dozens of them over the years, and it's difficult. Again, it's difficult because you're not getting something for nothing. Starting with the federal program, it's for a building that is eligible or listed on the National Register. However, if you have a National Register listed district, then every contributing building that's on that list, it could be a whole Main Street, and every building that's named within that district is eligible. If you're not listed yet, the issue is that initially the state and feds will determine if you're eligible, and when you finish your rehab, you will list the building. So you're either listed up front or you end up listed. That is a 20% federal rehab credit on qualified expenses. 20% of your total rehab cost is a write-off. Now you have to have some income. Maybe you put a partnership together with people who have income. And then what's really exciting in the past year is that the state of California, under the new governor, not the former governor, the legislature passed and the governor signed a state tax credit law that piggybacks on top of the 20% federal rehab credit. Now, this piggyback it goes through the same review process, but it's harder to get qualified for it because we have no rules for it yet. The regulations have not been adopted. The state, while it's on the books, hasn't allocated the money to support the program. So it's one of those kind of gotcha situations where you say, yay, we finally got a 20 or 25% piggyback on top of a 20% tax credit, but they're not letting us use it yet. As a famous TV host once said, can you imagine that? 45% write-off on your total rehab cost. We're talking hard and soft cost on the building footprint within the envelope of the building. And while we don't get the 45% yet, believe it's very real. I was emailing responses to questions from one of my 20% federal rehab tax credit clients today for a building that's in TIs that's being rehabbed. It's not everything, it's the missing piece for that project to have that 20% write-off. The 10% federal rehab credit is something we don't talk a lot about, but it's on the books. Preservationists don't like it because it doesn't require you to meet the standards for rehabilitation. The criteria easier. It's easier to use it for a non-historic building than it is a historic building, but people seldom do. But look it up. It's there. It's there for doing work on an existing building, much less a historic building. So here's some of the things to keep in mind if you've if you're like me and you're always trying to not to get people to hire to go through this process, which is onerous, but just to tell people this is really good. Where else are you going to get this much money? So start with eligibility. Then minimum qualified rehab expenses must exceed the tax basis of the building. So don't ask me any tax questions because I'll just say, call your tax advisor. But what I do understand is that, the tax basis is a critical issue, and, it varies sort of to a conventional mind like mine in an irrational way. If you buy a building today and pay $1 million for it, basically you have $1 million basis in the building. And the money that you must spend on that, your rehab, in order to be able to take any tax credit must exceed that amount. So if you have a building with $1 million basis, you must spend $1,001 in your rehab, otherwise you get no tax credit. However, if you have a building that's been in your family, or you've owned it for a while, or it's been uh, depreciated, it may have a basis of $500,000. So the first question is, how much money am I going to spend? And secondly, what's the basis of my building? And I better call my tax accountant right now. Part of my due diligence on this. Standards compliance is stringent. The people in state parks in Sacramento and the people in DC put us through our paces. They want to see what type of vinyl flooring you're using in the building, and we show them because it's worth it to answer all their questions and to protect our tax credit. Allow extra time. The process is you're gonna send something to Sacramento. They may have some questions for you to answer. And when you've satisfied those, they'll send it to Washington, DC. And if all goes well, DC will say, great state review, no problems, sign here. Or they may say, oh, we have some more questions. And while you're doing this, I didn't write this down, but coordinate with your local commission. Remember, your city council, your planning commission, your landmarks commission. They're also looking at this project potentially. And these three levels of government and all these agencies are not required to coordinate with each other. That's your job to see that what National Park Service thinks is a good storefront is the same storefront that your local commission or staff people think is a good storefront. It's not just the pretty restoration work, like the windows and the doors and the hardware and the brick repointing. It's all hard and soft construction expenses. All your systems, your roofing, your electrical, your mechanical, your lawyers, your accountants, your architects, your engineers, it's all eligible expense to get up to that. It's all qualified rehab expense. Now, once you get outside the building footprint, site work and additions or infill buildings are not part of your tax credit rehab expenses, but they do get reviewed. So if you have a property that has space on it for a new building, you'll only get tax deductions for your building you do on the historic building. But the reviewers will look for the compatibility if you decide to build a brand new building next to it, so that you're not, say, insulting that historic building with some ugly new thing that's too tall or too wide or too cheap. And this can, while the details of restoration and rehab aren't easy, word to the wise, plan early, because this is a debate for the ages. What's compatible new design relative to a district or to a historic building? Some really good news, and I say this for I'm channeling my clients, including the one I was talking to today, is that, let's say, the National Park Service, in signing off this work that we're doing, has forced us to do some things that we weren't quite happy, or it's not quite big enough, or we want to do something slightly different. Well, after 5 years after this work is put into service, all this rehab work, they're done. You're done with them. They go away, and you got your tax credit. But 5 years in, you have no constraints, except whatever other local constraints you may have. And to say it again, consult your tax advisor. It's part of the due diligence, whether it's a $500,000 property or a $50 million property. And we do those projects. $50 million times 20%, that's a lot of tax credit. And it's being done in downtown LA and San Francisco and other places. But don't overlook the $500,000 projects. Just know obviously you don't have quite the critical mass that you have with a bigger project, but there's money to be done there. And over the years, the state people in Sacramento have really wanted to help people make those smaller projects work, to show that it shouldn't be just the big corporations and the major investors who are salting away $1 million in tax credits. The smaller projects can work as well. Conservation easements. I think we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. This is something that is a really powerful tool, and the first person to do it gets a great write-off. Sort of in principle, you're giving away part of the fee simple interest in your building, whether it's the facade or sometimes it's some interior spaces, to a nonprofit, and taking a tax deduction for it. The sort of the best case scenario is that and I'm just making this up because I don't think it would happen. You've got a 20-story high-rise in downtown San Francisco, and you're entitled to build a 50-story building on that property. Give away the 30-story development potential to San Francisco Heritage, and you have a deduction of the value of that extra 30 stories. You need some very smart appraisers to figure out what that value is, because the IRS will look at you very closely. And appraisers have gotten into trouble inadvertently. It's a covenant that runs with the land. So once you have put that constraint on that building, or you've given away part of your interest in it to San Francisco Heritage, they're your friends forever, including anybody who buys the building. And they will, if you want to change something, you'll not only be talking to your local commissions and staff people, you'll be talking to the people who own the easement. And they won't go away except by mutual agreement. It is private law. It's a contract, and it'll run with the deed of the land. It can be undone, but both parties have to agree to undo it. And in closing, the California Historical Building Code has real help for people who have qualified historic buildings. And it's not just National Register listed. If you read the what goes with this, which is what's a qualified historical building, it's everything from a city adopted survey that says a building is eligible for listing locally, state, or nationally, up to buildings that are listed. And there are things that will help you get over expensive alterations and have productive conversations with your local building officials about what you're allowed to do using those alternative standards. Links for historic tax credits, Mills Act, conservation easements, and building codes. I think, Bill, this data these slides will be available. I'll leave that to
I will
you.
make them available, yes, as links off of the page or off of the video. Yes.
Thank you. I'm done.
Peyton, thank you so much. That was great and so pertinent. Dan, I'm going to look to you to help me field questions from those tuned in, but I have a couple questions of my own. Peyton, thinking of all the advantages that you mentioned, the economics that make such sense, maintaining the historic character, having that feel good factor. Um, what stops communities from embracing more of their historic neighborhoods?
At this point, the word expediency comes to mind, which is not meaning it's the path of travel in terms of time and planning and consulting fees is faster in this is my personal experience. You know, uh, you know, I have certain phrases that keep coming back to me. Like we did some really great projects in downtown LA with a big developer, and they said finally said, now we've got all this done. We're going to take a break from historic preservation because there's just too much brain damage. So it's saying we're doing this because we know it maybe it's going to take us a little bit more time, but the results are going to be better. You know, the places we live, shop, work in, our traffic, everything will be better for us if we will take the time to do the planning and to integrate all of these thoughts. Um, and you know, they that's sort of the macro view. The micro view is like is my this client whose name I've not been naming that I was talking to today, um, knowing that he's working on a really significant building and he's renting to a really significant tenant and everybody's watching him, and he knows that when this gets done, this is going to be a fantastic project and people are going to look to this Julia Morgan building in downtown LA and say, boy, they sure did the right thing here. It's not another glass tower. It it's a century-old building and it's beautiful, and students are studying there every day. And it took me it was a huge headache to get there. This is what I do.
Yeah, no, I get that. So, in working with different communities from Los Angeles to smaller communities, um, do you find that some of the challenges and the time it takes to process the project comes from staff that don't understand preservation, or they don't have the background in preservation? Do you come up against that?
Um, yes, it's I would put in a big pat on the back to USC, for example, because in the past 20 years, we've now graduated a generation of people in heritage conservation who are working as conservators, who are working for general contractors, working as city staff, in city government, and as private consultants who are informed. And it's so much easier than going to a city um, where people don't know what the criteria are or how CEQA connects, California Environmental Quality Act connects to what you're doing with a local landmark property. Um, so having that without, say, informed commission, informed government, um, because local staff can be very constrained by their elected officials who maybe don't. This is not meant to be patronizing. It just, you know, we've been around the we've been around the barn a few times. You know, there's some people who will speak not speak kindly of you for getting in the way of redevelopment and major housing projects, where others will say, I get it, it's part of our plan. And also having your staff feel comfortable that they know what they're doing. And I think they're increasing number who do, but they're not going to be scared of their departmental director coming down and saying, you know, I just got a call from Councilman Smith and Councilwoman Jones, and they don't like, they want you to go easy on this guy. So those are the things, Bill, that I see as stressors to me and stressors to city staff.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Dr. Casey Greeny asks, how do the tax credits apply to nonprofits?
Well, this is this amazes me. Until I learned better, it seemed pretty simple that if you're going to take a tax credit, you have to be a tax-paying entity, right?
Yeah, you think.
So it's done through the magic of lawyers and accountants. Two projects. One, when I first started at this company in 1995, we did two successor tax credits at the Shrine Auditorium, which belongs to the Shriners. And because they operate and they lease to a lot of companies, they set up a tax-paying entity, and they did it that way. More recently, and this is the one that really blows my mind, as they say, the Beverly Hills Post Office, which is a great revival building on Santa Monica Boulevard, was converted with an addition on the rear to the city's Performing Arts Center. So here's a federal building that was transferred with, I think, some payments to the city of Beverly Hills to a government entity. The government owns the land and the building, and they have an operating agreement with the Wallace Annenberg Center for Performing Arts, which is a nonprofit. So the nonprofit, the Wallace Annenberg Center, set up a tax-paying entity with Bank America, who took $5 million worth of tax credits in a construct that collapses immediately upon the ending of the 5-year period. Who knew? Yes, you can be a nonprofit on government land and have a legal tax construct that will get you a $5 million tax credit.
I love America. Natasha Juliana asked a question that I have run into also, and that is, do the best practices for historic preservation or rehabilitation conflict with those of creating a green building? And the examples she comes up with are roof materials and windows, storm windows. I'm thinking of solar panels. That seems to conflict sometimes with a historic building.
Yes, and I also sit on the local preservation commission for Angelino Heights in LA. So I'm not trying to own the point, but I deal directly with homeowners as a reviewer as well. And we have a neighborhood of some 19th century buildings. I think the answers to the windows is you can do this with historic buildings, primarily through weather stripping, and if necessary, internal storm windows like indos. And you can reach very high levels of performance with your windows. The broader point, which is I can't calculate for you, is that, and I'm sure no one is proposing to replace wood windows with vinyl windows. Vinyl is toxic, but what's very true, and I've experienced this as a homeowner and a owner of rental property, is that vinyl windows and aluminum windows are not as durable as wood windows and cannot be repaired and recycled. Insulated glazing units fail. So what you're looking at in the long term is that if you properly weather strip and maybe secondarily glaze your wood windows and maintain them, they will last longer, and the bottom line energy investment will be less than replacing them with new windows that with insulated glazing, which have a shorter life cycle.
Yeah, that actually doesn't surprise me about the windows. I've heard that before, surprising as it is.
We have a state law on the, just briefly on the solar panels. I know because we face this in Angelino Heights. The state has forbidden us to forbid anyone from putting solar panels on their roofs.
Mm.
I think it's a state law now, but we have that constraint. We cannot tell people not to use solar panels.
Yeah, I don't think that's been tested here yet. I'm not sure of that, but I'm not aware of it. Dan, do you see other questions that I have not?
There's some interesting comments in the chat, but one question John Sheehy asks is, at what point does a historical preservation renovation cost cross the line into becoming merely facadism? And my own addition to that is, and does it matter if it preserves the character of the neighborhood?
Yeah, local rules vary, and it's easy to say that it's complicated because there's not just one right or wrong answer to that. You know, there are criteria for integrity. If you look up the 7 aspects, you know, Google the 7 aspects of integrity. I think in a well-run landmarks program where CEQA applies, and CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, almost always applies to historic resources because there's almost always a discretionary review involved. You're looking at the interior and all 4 walls and a roof, and you're looking, and particularly for tax credits, you're looking inside the building for character. I kid, and this is not, shouldn't be a funny joke to preservationists. You know, the best project for an investor who has a historic building is to find one that's already been gutted, but is still eligible for or listed as a local landmark, because then you have a lot more flexibility on the inside of the building. So a facade, if you preserve a facade and make it really pretty and build a big new building around it, no matter how compatible the building is should no longer be eligible as a historic resource. You've lost it. If you go through a proper CEQA review, much less a local landmarks review, well, that's a pretty facade, but it's no longer a building.
Cool. Thank you. I'm scanning through the rest here, and I don't see any other particular questions except for Janet Graychick's kind of question about local policy, which I don't think Peyton is in a place to answer. And I don't know that we have, she basically asks if, she says, in the past year, city manager tried to keep fees minimal for historic property for any review for proposed work, saying the homeowners shouldn't have to pay extra, especially given the community benefit for retaining historic buildings. And I don't know, because I've only dealt with the planning department on really simple stuff. So,
well, I would welcome more input from her to say that if you look at the construct of many local historic preservation ordinances, whether they're new or rewritten, one of the incentives that we love to see is waiving permit fees for qualified historic buildings.
Yeah, that would be a great thing. We see so often that the historic neighborhoods are held to a higher standard, and yet they end up having to go through a much higher burden and a longer process to deal with that hardship. It'd be great if somehow that could be equalized, or some added benefit to ease the hardship. I agree with that. I have one last question, Peyton, and I should know more about the answer, but I don't. And that is, Petaluma has been trying to become a certified local government. And my understanding is that becoming a certified local government allows you to become eligible for more grants. There's greater opportunities for funding if you're a certified local government. Can you explain a little bit about how a certified local, what it is and how it affects a community with historic resources?
I can a little bit, Bill, because it's not my area of expertise.
Okay, fair enough.
The parts of it that I know about it, as Catherine is commenting, it requires cities to behave in certain ways. For example, you need a landmarks commission that has a composition of certain types of professionals, and I think you need a good landmarks ordinance. With respect to grants, there are grants that are not nearly big enough, but they're real and they're useful. And most commonly where we see this is that many CLGs get grants from Sacramento to do survey work. So this is the, if you're going to have a historic preservation, you know, and good for LA, Survey LA surveyed 800,000 parcels in
Wow.
the past decade. So they know where the historic buildings are buried, and that's a great starting point. And it's there. The people who look at the cup half empty say, we don't want to know where historic buildings are because we're afraid somebody's going to cause some problems for us. The other people say, if we know where they are, not only can we save them, we can give them grants, we can support them, we can avoid more surprises to homeowners and developers by saying, here's our survey map, here are our districts, here's what's in the works. Sort of take the crazy guesswork out of it, where you don't know whether you have a historic building or not. So those grants are really useful.
It does sound like that. I don't see many more questions. Do you, Dan?
I don't. I think this was super informative and interesting and dense. And yeah, I don't have any questions right now, and I'm excited for the next one.
It looks like Phil has his hand up. Is that, you're muted? Phil, do you have a question?
No, I was clapping for great presentation. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Peyton.
Nice to meet all of you.
It was great, Peyton. My biggest regret is that you were not all in the same room and we could go out and celebrate or something.
Well, I've actually been to Petaluma, and I hope to return one of these days.
It'd be great to see you sometime soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone who attended tonight. It was very informative, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Good night.
Thank you both.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Peyton.